I think what China's caught in is this race between collapse and technological supremacy. And I think collapse will win in the end. I mean, you have multiple issues going on where you have a kind of a horrific demographic picture.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey there. Welcome to the New Rules with Alan Pence, where we help you navigate today's chaos with precision. Your host, Alan Pence, has 25 years of experience working in business and government, and he knows how the old rules have fallen apart. Each episode, we'll explore how to thrive in this new landscape by mastering the new rules while everyone else is still figuring them out. Let's dive in.
All right, we are back with Tanya, and let's go to our topic.
Yeah, so you're ready for Hunger Games. Let's talk about it.
So I was continuing my analogies to bad movies.
I like it.
Yeah, talking about how post-election I've been thinking a little bit about the I think the trends that I'm talking about have existed and were going to manifest themselves over time, no matter what, even with the Harris administration. But I do think Trump will probably speed them up, and his willingness to be the bull in the china shop and break things and confront and maximize demands will lead to what I think is an inevitable final sort of breakdown in the system that we've been running for, really since toward the end of the Cold War. And I guess, like going back, sort of the theme of the pod is during the Cold War, the U.S. Built an alliance system and an economic system based on it as first, really, it is the economic engine of the world post-World War II, where we were 50% of world GDP and producing most of the goods. Then that gradually started shifting over the decades until you got to maybe the late 60s, early 70s, where the trade balance started to shift, where the U.S. was importing more as we grew as more consumer society versus production. But then at the same time, our share of GDP, relative share, we were getting richer overall, still the richest country, but our relative share was going down kind of inevitably. I don't think there was anything wrong with that. That just meant other people were doing better. But the system we constructed didn't adjust. So we had constructed this system with the dollar at the center and everybody uses it for world trade. And because everyone demands dollars, that pushes up the value. I think when people want something with, more demands, the dollar goes up. And as a result, we had to continue to supply dollars, which is why we run deficits. So without deficit assets, there's no reserves for people to buy, right? If you don't run deficits. It's one of the problems with the EU. The euro can't be a full-on reserve currency. It's a partial reserve currency, but they just don't issue enough debt. To some extent, France does it, but really what they need is Germany to do it if they wanted that, which they don't. So the U.S. kind of did that, and now our percentage of GDP has continued to shrink. Yet we still supply 60+% of reserve currency assets, and as that happens, it's become an increasing burden on the United States. And so, in part two of this, I'm going to talk about how to resolve that and how the U.S. can approach that. But the reality is we are now at a point where we're starting to break that system. The system just doesn't work anymore because our deficits have to keep going up and up and up. We can't sustain almost any manufacturing capacity in the United States because the dollar is so high. And now the U.S. share of, really we're the least trade exposed country in the world at this point. I mean, not the
Are we?
But of developed. Of the developed economies, maybe North Korea has less trade, but as a share of GDP, we trade very little with the rest of the world. Our exports are minimal, at least on the good side. The U.S. tends to export services like Google and Apple and stuff like that, right? Mm-hmm. But we don't export a ton of goods, manufactured goods anymore, and particularly as a percentage of our economy. And our exports are high, but we still produce a lot of stuff internally for ourselves. Plus, we're also, I think the big shift in that too, even though some on the good side, we import more because of U.S. energy independence and fracking, we don't import oil or gas anymore, right? So that was a big factor back in the early 2000s. And since the fracking revolution, U.S. is now a net exporter, not an importer. So that's made a big change. So as, I see the U.S. kind of getting to the end of this system where we allowed other countries to use us as a consumer base to build their own economies. And as our share of GDP has shrank, and quite frankly, our exposure on the export side, like we don't export that much, as that shrank, the U.S. now has nothing to gain from the system. And we have very little to lose from correcting it. So I think with the big factor that happened was that China came in and sort of they took a situation that wasn't great, and we were able to maybe curb the worst aspects of. So like back in the 80s, when Japan was really the main export leader, we forced them in a thing called the Plaza Accords in the 80s to appreciate the yen versus the dollar so that we became more competitive.
We bullied them into that.
Right? So, and because they're under our defense umbrella and are completely dependent on the U.S. economy, they had to comply, right?
Mm.
And that led to the bubble in Japan. And then when that popped, now we've had 3 decades of decreasing Japanese competitiveness. And they call it the lost decade, and it could really be the lost couple decades for them. So really soon after that, we let China into the WTO, and then they became Japan on steroids. And I think, I was saying, from the perspective, like we can't do a Plaza Accords with China, nor do I think they can adjust their economy very easily. I think the big problem for China is in order for them to adjust, they really need to start producing things that their own people want to buy. And
But will they do that?
Yeah, I think that in order to do that, you would have to have massive labor transfer. So all these state-owned enterprises and others that were built to overproduce and then export that overproduction, so you see that with like BYD and all these other companies that they would have to lay off workers, and those workers would then have to go work for new kinds of companies that produce goods that people in China want to buy. Now, it's not that they don't buy EVs. It's just they're not going to buy the number of EVs that are being produced, right? So all that overproduction, instead of just trying to dump it on the world market, increasingly what China needs to do is move those people into healthcare services, and they have to become psychologists, and they have to become all the things that we have, go into working on things like Google and Microsoft and the service kind of sector transition that we did in the United States.
But China has no social safety net, Alan. So how are we going to move them into, how would that work?
So they're not going to do it. So there's no way they can do it. First of all, they have no social safety net, and they're already incredibly indebted, and more so than the United States. So they don't, although I think they're going to need to run some increase deficits to stimulate the economy at some point. They really have a debt burden already starting out that's colossal. Yeah. And most of that's been pushed off into the local governments, into these local government funding institutions that are quasi-private. So they don't show up on the books, but they're there, right? So it's all there. Mm-hmm. So already they're coming at a point where they're at high deficits. So, expanding the social safety net and running big deficits is a limited ability for them. And then they would have massive unemployment if they had to shift the SOEs into more consumer-based production, into producing services. Like those LOEs, you can't go from making refrigerators to providing healthcare services, right? Yeah. So I just think that kind of transition would probably collapse the government. I mean, if you have that kind of mass unemployment, I just don't see China keeps itself together. I mean, the United States went through this transition, and it was the Great Depression and World War II. And these were fraught. We had 25+% unemployment, right? I mean, I just don't see China being able to survive that, right? Mm-hmm. The U.S. is much more resilient in that sense, even with our fractious politics. So that fractious politics helps. So basically with that table set, I was like, all right, what's going to happen with all these different players in the world? And it's kind of the 2-part thing. So the first part is kind of reviewing where everybody is. And then the second part is like, is the U.S. going to go it alone and kind of do the America first? It's just our way or the highway. which many people think we're going to do. I think probably we'll do a version. Or are we going to lead a group to reform the trading system with China on the outs, right? And I think we'll probably end up doing some version of that in between those two versions. So I'll talk a little bit about that next week. But just like looking at who the players are, like the table set, if you start and kind of use the Hunger Games, all the competitors coming to fight the Hunger Games. And the U.S. is really like the hero of the story here. So I'm American too, right? We're American, so of course I feel like that. But, we're district, whatever Candace is from. District 9, I can't remember, but
No.
Sure, it's District 1?
No, I don't remember.
Yeah, I'll have to look it up. But so we're that, and I guess like Canada and Mexico, or that lame guy that she had with her who gets killed at some point, Peter, or whatever his name was.
Yeah.
He's kind of like vanilla, and he just gets killed off, and no one really cares. So that's probably Canada and Mexico for this. But, I think we're playing the best hand here. Like we've got, like as I reviewed, like still the largest economy, largest military. We're probably the only military power that can project power in every corner of the globe. We also, technological leadership is there, although I think it's being challenged by China. But if you look at AI in particular, I mean, the U.S. is leaps and bounds ahead. But if you look at advanced manufacturing, I'd say maybe we're not. So that's the big weakness, I think. Yeah. But, we've got a resilient political system. Look, people criticize us and say, oh, look at the polarization. But we are fighting the big fights and we're resolving the issues to some extent, right? Other countries like Japan has democracy, but they don't actually fight about the main issues. They do everything by consensus. Or you have China, which is completely authoritarian, so they can't make these adjustments, right?
There's no fight.
Yeah, right. So I think the fight is good. And I think you're going to see more of it in different countries, right? Which is a good thing. And the U.S., talked about energy independence, our low trade, exposure. We have the ability, again, maybe in the short term, we're going to crack down on immigration. But hopefully, I think we saw in the first Trump administration, 2 years into the crackdown, immigration was now popular again, right? So I think we're going to see a reaction against those policies. And, what I'd like to see is an expanded, more merit-based, high-skill immigration policy, but very open to bringing in people. And in the United States, immigrants integrate much more effectively in the society than almost any other place in the world. I mean, really, it's the Anglophone countries, UK, Australia, us, Canada, where that works. If you're a top researcher, an African or some other university, do you want to go live in Beijing or do you want to live in Palo Alto? I mean, I don't think it's much of a contest. So I think that those are really the strengths of the United States. And plus we have this legacy alliance network that we can pick up and use or discard or whatever, but we have options, right? So I think, I wouldn't want to play any other hand but the United States' hand. But if you go, so shift over to your neck of the woods.
Right.
Yeah, despite Spain's growth, right? I think the EU is probably the player playing one of the worst hands. And next to China, probably. And I think this is the result of the sort of half-pregnant version of the EU, right? Where it's sort of a union, but it's not.
And not really.
Right. So what would really work is if Germany turned into the US and they started running big deficits and then allowed all the other countries to export, all the other EU countries to build up their manufacturing bases and export, particularly the newer Eastern European countries. To some extent that happened, but Germany is really the economic driver. So to get innovation and dynamism going in the EU, you've got to have Germany take the leadership. You just froze, but Dan, you're cool. So yeah, to get dynamism going in the EU, you really have to have Germany run deficits. And they are the economic engine. They've got to become the US. And then you need to integrate all these things. In addition to free trade, you need a consolidated debt market. You need to break down some of these cultural barriers so that products can be more easily sold across different countries. There isn't a tremendous amount of labor mobility in the EU because of the language and cultural barriers. So it just feels to me like the EU would have to become like, and you have to get rid of these stupid energy policies, right? It's not energy independent. So really, the best thing that Germany could do was become the US, run deficits, and get a peace deal in Ukraine so they can get Russian gas back.
I can
That would probably
Europeans just going nuts right now to like become
right, exactly.
now. Do you know how many times people have said to me, "I'm glad you don't live there now after the election"?
Right.
Like,
Right. Well, I mean, short term it might feel good. The long term, I think it's a bad hands, right? And I think the other thing is like immigration is a pretty strong issue in the EU, right? They don't
well, yes, yeah.
people probably don't love Spanish immigrants, or Spanish immigrants probably don't love German immigrants, much less like people from other parts of the world, right? So I see this as like a recipe for disaster. I mean, initially I thought that Germany and Europe could kind of play Russia or play China and the US off each other. I think that's probably a losing strategy. What you're seeing now is, so what you're seeing now is a lot of German companies like Siemens and Volkswagen investing a lot into China, and they're trying to build themselves up by going into the Chinese market to serve the Chinese market. And to me, this is like picking up nickels in front of a steamroller, right? Because the Chinese do not want your companies. So like I said in the piece, like China wants to be Germany. It doesn't want to partner with you, right? It wants to take over. So it's like going to knife you, cut your skin off and wear it, right? It's like Buffalo Bill or whatever in the Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah, that's a scroll example.
Yeah, so they did that was a good movie, but I think that's the problem. And like you're seeing Germany's exports are decreasing to China because China's trying to become more autarkic and bring that technology in. So they'll let Siemens and Volkswagen in, steal all their shit, and then kick them out, right? And then, just take their factories. And so I just don't see a way that there's a great path in the future for the EU with China. It'll work for a while. So really then their only option, given that they can't build out their own defense base, given that Germany's not going to go into debt to like drive the continent itself, is vassalhood to the United States. And I think that worked really well in the Cold War. That's what drove all their growth. It's like, hey, let the US do the security umbrella, and we'll export our goods to them and build our economies. Well, that worked really great when you were the center of the world, and the center of the Cold War was, at the Brandenburg Gate. Now the center of the Cold War is in the South China Sea. So I don't think the US really cares that much about the EU. It's a good market, a lot of people, but I don't think the terms that the EU is going to get from the United States are going to be what they think they're going to be. And so you've lost your importance. You can't drive your own growth. You can't defend yourself. It just feels like, hey, this is a set of circumstances. So like, is Germany more afraid of debt than they are of being part of the American empire and a minor part? I think that the answer might be yes. And that's not great. But I'd rather see Europe stand as a stronger player, but I just don't see that possibility.
When you put it there, it doesn't sound very good. It's not.
No, it's not good.
Unable to defend.
No, and then, and you have an aging population. And you have a welfare state that's going to be unsupportable in another 10, 20 years.
Once they figure out immigration.
Right. And you don't want to bring people in. So you just go around and around, right? And, I think that there's going to be a big crisis in the EU. I think you also have like Germany with very low deficits, France with very high deficits. And how do you have run one economic policy that satisfies both those conditions? Like I think
you can.
The EU is probably, I think the EU is probably going to have to break up in some form or other, right? I think the euro certainly will have to go away. That doesn't mean like every aspect of the EU goes away. I don't think it can survive as a political hero.
True.
So I'm pretty pessimistic on the EU, as people probably have noticed in my
but people are probably picking up on that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's go to like a little better part of the world. Well, actually, let's visit another bad before we go to the good.
Okay.
So then I look at China, and China is a puzzle to me. I'm going to bring some more people to the pod about this, but I think they're playing a pretty bad hands
Yeah, you wrote that. And
But
why?
yeah, so like on the positive side, you look at, hey, they are taking leadership in multiple advanced technology areas, particularly in advanced manufacturing. If you could build an awesome EV, you could build an awesome tank and an awesome fighter jet. So I don't see what's going to stop them from doing that.
Right.
But I think what China's caught in is this race between collapse and technological supremacy. And I think collapse will win in the end. I mean, you have multiple issues going on where you have a kind of a horrific demographic picture where they really peaked, 5-10 years ago, and the population is declining. There's no social safety net. And you're going to have something, I mean, it's like 20, I can't remember the year, like 2050, you're going to have like 10 retirees for every worker.
Yeah.
And they have no social safety net. So who's going to support these people, right?
Well, the policy has come, I mean, that's no longer there, but now you're seeing,
Right.
all those one children are.
Yeah. And now even, they've released that limit and no one's having babies still. And I can't remember who said it, but as far as I know, it takes 30 years to make a 30-year-old. So I don't think there's any relief coming. Even if they start having babies today,
Right.
it's 30 years until that pays off, right? So I see a shrinking workforce, huge problem for the overhang of all these old people, already massive debts that are unresolved. They still won't stick all this debt on one group. They slowly, unfortunately, what I think is happening now is they're sort of sticking the consumer with part of it, with the housing bubble bursting. And so most people's wealth that they would take care of their parents with, or their parents would take care of themselves with, was in housing, and they're deflating that. The value of housing is going down. So now you're watching your retirement savings kind of deflate away.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't really help you. So that seems a little scary. And then, they're in a hostile neighborhood, and the solution they've picked is to export their way out of this problem. Like, we're going to go into we're going to go take all our real estate and infrastructure building, and we're going to put all those resources into these SOEs and other companies to make more EVs, make more solar panels, make more robots, make more of this, make more of that, which in some ways can work. And like, if you're Japan, you can kind of get away with it, even with a large economy. But China's the second largest economy in the world. They're already a massive exporter, and they've now, post-pandemic, the export percentage of GDP has skyrocketed. I mean, their trade surplus with the rest of the world is massive now. And I think people just can't absorb it. I mean, you're seeing this. Trump's sitting there going, they're going to slap tariffs on everything. The EU starting to slap tariffs on them. Pakistan, one of their ostensible pseudo-allies, is slapping tariffs on them. They just can't. There's just not enough people in the world to buy all their shit. Yeah. And as the U.S. starts shutting down area after area to shift production to the United States, or maybe friendshore, I know that they're looking at, hey, the global South and the developing world. Well, these people just don't make enough money to buy all your stuff, right? I mean, only the U.S. really can absorb. And now we've hit max capacity. I don't think there's any way. So I just don't see how the strategy works.
Okay.
Like, in the end, they're going to massively they're already doing it. They're massively overproducing, and there's not going to be enough people to buy their stuff. So it strikes me that you hit this crisis point at some point where you're going to have mass unemployment, and you're going to have all these people retiring, and a huge debt burden. Feels like the whole thing is like teetering.
Nobody to take care of them either.
Right. So then I worry that that's the point of maximum danger, though, because they're still big, right? They still got a ton of people. They still produce a lot of stuff. So if the government really starts seeing that the long term isn't good, that they know it's going to go this way, I think that they lash out. I think there's probably a war that comes from that.
So what timeline you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to predict. People have been predicting the collapse of China for
years,
15 years.
Right. So
yeah. So I don't think it's imminent. I think we're still in the adjustment phase where people are just figuring out what China's doing. And I don't think the prospects for the Trump administration going full bore, I can't predict what they're going to do. But I see Trump probably cutting some kind of deal with Xi, where he agrees to move some production to the United States. Like so BYD builds a factory in Tennessee or Texas or whatever. But I don't see that long term, they're not going to follow up on that deal, right? So they might build a couple things, but they need the jobs there. And they are not going to put industrial plant in the United States if they can avoid it, right? Because we just seize it and we'll steal their technology like they did to us, right? So I see them cutting a deal and then not really following through on it. And then it's after that the real, now maybe they don't even, maybe Trump goes hardcore and tries to break right now without doing a deal. But my guess is he kind of does a version of what he did in the first term and cuts a deal that the Chinese don't fall through. And so I don't know, what is that, 10 years down the line? Something like that?
Yeah.
5-10 years.
Nobody knows.
It's really hard to say. It's like, at what point does Xi see clearly enough? Like that the end, that I think at this point, they still think they can win. And there comes a point at which you realize it's not going to happen. And I don't know, how long does it take like a dictator who doesn't listen to anybody to figure that out? I can't tell you. But I certainly think within the next 20, 15 years, there's going to be some massive break. And it could come sooner based on actions, that we take.
But you talked about, a few weeks ago, we talked about, China sees itself as just recouping its rightful place of glory and world dominance. So this isn't going to be something that's going to happen soon or easily.
Right. Yeah, they're not going to give up easily.
I can't imagine thinking, I'm just going to fold.
Cool. So let's move on to like a happier set of countries.
So like the tigers, how about the Asian tigers, India? Let's talk about some other,
Let's do India. So I think India is playing really good cards.
Okay.
And India is probably the one country that can play the US and China off each other. So in contrast to the EU, where they're no longer at the center of the stage, I think India is right at the center of the stage. And the US needs India as a balance against China. And it's a massive market as well. I think it already is the largest population in the world. It certainly has demographic challenges coming, but not as severe or soon as China's. And while, Indian power is limited, it does exercise a certain amount in the region. And so I really see them being able to cut a deal with both sides and be able to play both sides off each other. In the end, I think they will probably be a U.S. ally, but India has a long history of playing in between, like with, right now they're doing business with Russia, not paying attention to our sanctions, and they can get away with it. All right. So I think they will. They also have, a good technical capability and seem to grow synergistically with the United States and Silicon Valley. So I really see, India really thriving over the next, generation. And, the question is, can they cohere enough internally, build enough infrastructure, all that kind of stuff to kind of take the place of China? I don't see them maybe doing that just because they have such internal coherence problems and such massive poverty.
What do you mean by that when you say internal coherence problems?
Just the number of ethnic minorities and different regions. And like, it's just not a very cohesive country in that way. It's a big, messy democracy and it kind of works. So like, I think they're going to do well. I don't see them becoming, I think they'll do well, but I don't see them being a globe spanning power. They'll be a important regional player. And then, I think they'll do well and maintain some amount of independence. And then I think Japan and South Korea and Australia also will do well. Now, they're clearly under the U.S. umbrella, so they're not going to be playing the U.S. off of China. They're going to be, working with the U.S. But I think, again, they kind of play the role maybe of Germany and France and Britain, right? They're on the front lines. And, to be honest, like if China invades Taiwan, we need like the Philippines, Japan, Australia. India is probably not going to get involved in that, right? They don't really care. So those powers are going to be able to negotiate good terms, I think, with the United States because we need them to be strong and we need them to be part of our alliance. So I see them doing very well. I think we're going to probably do a lot of bilateral trade deals. We're going to, and I think they also have, with the exception of Australia, Japan and South Korea have horrific demographics as well. I think South Korea might be the worst in the world.
Yeah.
and they can't take immigrants, right? But they also have done very well at moving production to other countries, like the United States. They also have done amazingly well in robotics and automation, and I think we'll push them to continue that lead. That's the counter to China. So I think, the story there is good, and they're rich, so they can pay. They have social safety nets, so they can, it'll be a burden, but they'll be able to adjust to the older population. Yeah, that much better than like China or something. And Australia, I think, lives off of immigration. So I think they can absorb tons of immigrants pretty easily. So I think Australia stays like a good middle power with a good relationship with the United States, and they can demand good terms. So I think those countries all do well. And then also the Asian tigers. So, Philippines, Thailand,
Indonesia,
Vietnam, Indonesia. And these guys are going to try, I think what they're going to try to do is what India is doing, try to play the US off of China. But I don't think it's going to work in the long run. I think they'll get some benefit out of that for a while, particularly at the low end of the manufacturing spectrum. There's a lot of Chinese companies moving into Vietnam to get around US sanctions, and just in general, they have cheaper labor. So I think they'll, I don't think she's sitting there going, hey, we got to maintain a lead in textile manufacturing, right? He doesn't care about that. So they'll let them do that, and maybe even export to China because it's the low end stuff, sort of what we did in the beginning. Like China wasn't a threat. They were just making all the cheap crap that didn't make sense to make here. But as soon as those countries try to climb sophistication ladder, China's going to slam that door. And I think the other aspect of that is the U.S. increasingly is going to be looking at their supply chains and monitoring them. So maybe we'll probably, they probably shut down, like if you produce a bunch of stuff with Uyghur slave labor, we're not letting it through. But as soon as, again, so like textiles, it might not matter quite as much to us. But as they start moving up that chain, if they have significant Chinese components, they're going to get shut out of Western markets. So I think, and then you add on to that their only choice militarily is the US. I mean, China's just going to blow them apart, right?
Yeah.
They're so much bigger and they're right there. The only balancing force they have is the US. So I think that in the end, they have to move under the US umbrella. But I think they got some flexibility until it really, and they're going to do well at that time. And when they move under the US umbrella, I think we'll give them relatively good terms, just like we do with Japan and South Korea. So to me, and then, I kind of hit some other regions, but like you look at those like Central,
right?
Yeah, like Central Asia and Pakistan. I mean, they're screwed. They're just going to be Chinese vassal states that take turns for Xi, and they're never going to be good. And then I look at other continents, and I just don't think they matter that much. Like, it doesn't really matter what happens in Africa. I mean, I know we get all freaked out about China getting some uranium mine and Namibia, but to be honest, it doesn't matter. And, I think 50 years, if the population changes, stay on track, and Africa is a major population center, maybe at that point it really matters, but I don't see anything until then that really matters that much. And then, South America is similar. I don't think it really matters that much. Brazil will have relations with China and because of the commodity exports, but I don't really see the U.S. caring that much. Oh, yeah. And then the two I didn't have. Yeah, Russia. Again, I rate the chances of Russia mattering that much very low. So I know that in the United States, we're all spun up about it, but it's an aging petrostate, declining population. They have nuclear weapons and they have a lot of resources. So yes, they will matter to some extent, but I don't think the Chinese care that much about them. And I think eventually, once the Ukraine thing gets resolved, they probably reintegrate supplying gas and stuff to the European Union as they slowly die off. So I mean, I don't see it's like, there's some danger there, but I don't think we need to spend a long clock cycles on Russia.
So tell explain again, or why wouldn't the Chinese think that Russia matters? I know you've talked about this.
Just because they don't have it. I mean, I think they matter in the sense of like, hey, we want your gas and your natural resources, just like Brazil matters. But I just don't think they see them as a threat or a huge ally. And then they have some weapons production, but I think we've seen that the U.S., as we saw just recently in Iran, where they knocked out the Russian-made air defense systems and flew over the country at will. So I don't really see the Chinese like super depending on the Russians for military supplies. Maybe, I'm not a military expert, so maybe I'm off a little bit. But, just like you're going to have within the next generation, there's going to be 30, 40 generations left of like this vast territories.
Right.
I just don't see the economy sucks. And, it just doesn't seem like a real viable player going forward. I think it's probably punching its last punches here.
Mm-hmm.
The only danger is, collapse in nuclear weapons. Yeah, right now they still have some power, but I think it's declining by the day, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the U.S., if the U.S. untied the hands of, as we saw with those missiles that just went in, the ACATs or whatever, as soon as we untie the hands and actually use real weaponry against them, they're not going to win. So, but they're still a nuclear power, so we can't. They're not in Africa, right?
Yeah,
they're not Brazil.
It's nothing to sneeze at, too.
Right. But I just don't see them being a major player going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and then the Middle East, right? So,
we can't forgive them.
That's right. Yeah. So, as far as the U.S. is concerned, so just overall, I see the Middle East as kind of status quo.
Mm-hmm.
Oil is still really important, or gas, despite people's supreme dreams, and they will be a major supplier. I do see the Trump administration really driving the Abraham Accords to conclusion. I think it'll work. Mm-hmm. Where, you have a Saudi-Israeli alliance against Iran and its proxies, Syria and Lebanon. And, I think he'll just have a standoff, probably a relative shift in the balance of power toward Saudi Israel. But I don't think it'll matter that much. It'll just be like, to be honest, I don't think we really care what happens in the Middle East from a strategic standpoint. All we care is that someone else doesn't dominate.
Mm.
So it's still important because China needs it. And if we allow China to somehow project power, then take over there, they can use that, coerce everyone else. But with our own energy independence is no longer as vital to us. But it's still a strategic important part of the world. So I see us like trying to maintain some kind of alliance network there, stabilize it, make sure Iran can't be too dominant, and then just kind of like moving on with our lives. Because, really what we need to do is be working on those alliances in South China Sea and East Asia, right? So that's where the focus has to be. And everybody else is sort of a bit player outside of that we want to take. So that's my little review of the world.
It's a new framework.
Yeah. And so next week, we're going to talk about how I see the options for the U.S. So I called it like in the Hunger Games, everybody's fighting each other. And then eventually a bunch of them get together and unite to take on the government, putting, the capital that puts on the games. And so like, what are the prospects? I think really only the United States can do it to take on the capital and the Hunger Games. I think China could, and if it's changing to a different country, but it's not going to.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll go into depth about that, and I'll talk about some of the options for the Trump administration and subsequent successor administrations.
And
that's it for this week.
Yeah, that was great. That was pretty succinct.
Yeah, we just we checked off the world.
Just like literally every part of the world, like boom. Done.
I have a lot of listeners in Moldova, so I wonder how they'll react to that.
In Moldova, really?
Pessimism on Russian. Yeah, for some bizarre reason. You get these like reports from, it's mostly from Spotify, but there's some weird countries like, I had some Belgian listeners last week. So many people love me talking crap about the Germans.
Yeah, that's it was around the world.
I know. I gotta go incognito if I go to Berlin. So
yeah, you might.
It's only my love of the Germans. They're my people. So
of course,
German heritage. So
you have a cultural affinity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Until next week.
All right. Good to talk to you. Enjoy your turkey.
Thanks.
You've been listening to The New Rules with Alan Pence. For more insights on mastering the new game, follow @apence, that's APENTZ, on X, and make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, in today's world, you don't follow the rules, you write them.